The eyes opened like a lantern underwater. For a second, the beam of my maglite cut through moss and brath and shadow, and there it was, a pair of amber ovals, neither animal bright nor human soft, catching the light and holding it as if to measure me. My hands went cold inside the canvas of my jacket. The forest held its own breath. I had been in the field long enough to know how the world anchors itself in a single instant. Everything that had been routine before that point rearranged around those eyes. My name is Spencer Grant. In September of 1995, I was 39, an ex-high school biology teacher who had quit the classroom because the classroom felt too small for the kind of patience I had learned to love, the patience of waiting for seasons and animal habits, of turning the lens toward what moved slowly. I worked freelance for a small outfit called Cascade Wildlife Productions, filming bears and elk, mapping comportment and territories for television segments that preferred neat endings. I carried a Sony Handycam CCD TR81 for the quick, secretive work, a Panasonic AG455 for longer takes when the generator in camp cooperated, and a Nikon FM2 when still frames mattered. My kit was not glamorous. It fit into a battered shoulder pack along with a spare headlamp, a leathery maglite with a nicked head that had saved me from more than one storm, a roll of gaffer tape, and a couple of boots with soles like old promises. That night the forest smelled like wet bark and pine tar. It had rained 2 days earlier and then dried into a late summer heat that made the underbrush release a humid, dark sweetness. I was following a line of tracks, huge impressions that tore the leaf litter into moon-shaped scars. I measured the first one with a scrap of plywood I carried for that very purpose. 17 inches long, 7 inches across at the ball, the stride between prints averaging almost 5 feet. It was not a deer. It was not a bear. I had seen large bear prints before. They carried the claw marks like signatures. These had no outward nail impressions, and the toe spread suggested something that could splay like a hand. Whoever had left those tracks had chosen a path that threaded along a creek, near boulders that pooled tiny eddies, and where the forest carved itself into a sheltered overhang, the tracks paused. I should have backed out then. Any experienced fieldman would tell you the protocols. Record the evidence, mark your GPS, file your permits, notify the ranger station. But a particular kind of curiosity has its own gravity, and I had come up to this ridge to film bears in a place that was meant for patient watching. The trail angled under a curtain of moss and cedar. Steam rose from the damp earth in little columns where the sun caught it.
I remember the way my boots pressed into soil softened by years of leaf fall, how the nylon strap of the Handycam rubbed against my wrist, how the weight of the Nikon at my throat anchored me into a decision I would not later consider casual. The overhang was a pocket in the rock, sheltered and almost curated. There was a bed of softer material, cedar bark stripped into ribbons and layered like thatch, an arrangement of smooth stones that had been pushed into small piles as if sorted by some patient hand, and a wall where faint scratches ran across the stone face, marks that suggested counting or timekeeping, or both. The air inside the pocket was heavier and had an animal musk to it, a complex smell that was sweet, sharp, and iron wet where the moss had soaked root runoff. It smelled like being watched by the forest itself. I turned the Handycam on. The little red tally light glowed. I filmed for 22 minutes. I remember the number because later, when I told myself I had been clinical, I had to be able to list facts. 22 minutes on a Sony CCD TR81, a handheld, shaky at first because my hands would not stop moving. The creature lay within that pocket, shoulders broad beneath a ragged coat of hair that turned the light into ribbons. Its chest rose and fell with a slow, patient rhythm. Its hands, when they shifted, were long-fingered and careful, the nails dark and blunt. It had arranged its bedding in a way that suggested a mind at leisure with itself. For most of those 22 minutes, it did not open its eyes. The video held rows of hair and the slow stroke of a hand across a smooth pebble. There was a cadence to its breathing that felt older than seasonal cycles. Then, the eyes opened. It was not an immediate groggy awakening in the sense a human wakes. It was more like a long code turning into language. The amber flared, measured me, and did not flinch. It made a small grunting sound that I later learned to catalog as inquiry. I turned off the camera with a movement deliberate enough to be a promise, and for the first time since I had left the safety of an academic life, made a decision that bent toward protection instead of exposure. The 22 minutes of footage sat on my shoulder like contraband. I could have mailed it to an acquaintance at a network. I could have pitched an exclusive. I could have banked a sort of quiet fame. Instead, I slipped the tapes into a Ziploc, tucked them into my pack, and left the cassette recorder untouched in my hand. The ethical dilemma was immediate and raw. To air this would be to invite the world, with its footlights and hunger, into a place that needed darkness. I returned the next week with the Nikon only, leaving the big video rigs at base. My mode changed from hunter-observer to cautious companion. I started leaving things in the periphery of the overhang rather than in the bed itself.
A Snickers bar wrapped in wax paper, a tin of canned peaches with the ring bowl dented, a cheap flashlight with a dull bulb. The creature, in the spirit of survival and curiosity, consumed the Snickers carefully, peeling the paper and working the caramel with slow, ingenious gestures. It learned the flashlight meant light and placed it beside the bed like an offering. Some nights I brought a harmonica and figured out simple notes. Music, I had found in my years of watching animals, does not mean the same to a wild animal that it does to a human. For them, it is a sound that happens somewhere in space. For me, it was a way to map intentions. We developed rituals. I would approach along the creek where the roots created a softer walk, make a deliberate 2-knock on a hollow alder to announce my presence, and ease my pack down. The creature, never given a human name by me, came to recognize the pattern. It had been many things in my inner narration: an old man with slow hands, a shy giant, the forest's anomaly. Other people in town called such things names they were proud of. I called it old man to myself, because my instincts leaned toward tenderness. He, and he was a pronoun of approximation only, a habit of my own making, accepted the harmonica sometimes, curled it between fingers like a fragile twig. He taught me, indirectly, the economy of things in the wild. A rock used once becomes a tool for the next day. A scrape on a bark wall becomes notation. There were practicalities to this slow companionship. He favored certain tools: a smooth, flat stone for crushing berries, a short, stout stick he used to scratch patterns into the wall. He had a curious habit of resting his elbow in the same hollowed indentation in the rock, and then running his hand along the wall, perhaps counting the rings, perhaps sizing the years. I left food that would not rot quickly and would not attract bears: nuts, sealed cans, dried meat tucked in a waterproof pouch. I taught him, carefully and without spectacle, that a flashlight meant a human. When I first heard the creature imitate a harmonica note, I did not know whether to laugh or weep. There is a loneliness that comes when you break the code separating you from a place. You become part of the landscape in a way that is not shared in offices or in living rooms. I had chosen solitude as a vocation on purpose. The forest taught me the kind of listening that is almost like prayer. Yet companionship arrived in a form I had not expected. It filled a hollow that had been there since the classroom: the need to be understood, to be noticed, to be acknowledged as something that mattered beyond the function assigned by work or by town. When I say we over those months, I mean it in the sense of two consistent actors rehearsing a play for which we had not written lines. The ethical questions didn't evaporate. They lived with us like a low hum.
I kept notes in a battered field journal: dates, weather, the time I arrived, the length of the tracks, always around 17 inches, and the small changes in the scratching patterns on the wall. I documented tool use in sparse, objective bullets. I told no one, except once, in a moment of weakened resolve, a woman named Marge who worked the town store and had a way of footing her listeners with exaggerated sympathy. I asked her to say nothing, and she did not. She folded my secret into the town's secret seam, like a spare button you hope never to need. Then the fire happened. It was mid-August, but the weather had been fickle: a lightning strike miles away or an unattended campfire. The precise cause didn't matter to the way flames reeked through dry understory. The first sign was not a roar, but a sky gone wrong. In the distance, the horizon had a copper rim, and the smell of smoke braided through the ordinary forest scents like a warning. I remember the heat first, a sudden burning pressure that made the skin on my forearms prickle. The creek slowed into shallow pools, and steam rose like the breath of something enormous. Old Man's reaction was immediate and animal. He rose from his nest with a speed that painted him in a new light, not just strong, but urgent, aware of a taxonomy of danger I had only ever read about in reports. He moved toward the slope that led away from the overhang, but the fire had anticipated his path. A fallen limb lay across a notch of scrub, and it was alight, its bark flaring like a red tongue. Smoke rolled in eddies. Flames were not yet a wall, but they chewed at the undergrowth with the patient hunger of a predator. I could have stood frozen by the ethical gravity of intervening in a wild life. Instead, action felt like the only honest response. I had some tools: a small coil of nylon rope, a spare poncho, my mag light, and 2 hands that still worked. The physicality of the moment, the ready calculation of risk, and the moral tally that had been living with me since those first 22 minutes of footage collapsed into something almost simple: help him get to water. I made my way in front of him along the creek bed to the place where the fire's edge met wet rock. The smoke made my eyes sting. The maglight's beam was swallowed by the thick air, but was at least a mark I could see with an animal accustomed to the dark. I took the poncho off and threw it over a burnt, scented patch of brush to smother a brush fire that was leaping embers forward like a greedy hand. The rope became a makeshift drag when I looped it around a fallen limb propped like a gate. He hesitated when I offered it, and he looked at me in a way that translated over my years of fieldwork into question and fear. "Will I be safe if I go with you?" I did not answer aloud. I found a low path through fur and slippery with morning wet, and I put my shoulder under the weight of a small rock that could bridge the gap in a burnt section of the trail.
He moved then, slow and indebted, and his muscles flexed like compressed timber. There was a moment as we slipped past a pocket of flame when a hot coal came loose and landed on my boot. I kicked it off and felt the heat burn the leather. He made a low sound that I later would describe as something like alarm, and for the first time I saw him scoot a little ahead, as if he meant to shepherd me too. He knew this terrain in an intimacy that I did not. He tested the ground like a blind man counts steps, and more than once he reached back to see if I followed. He moved through a ring of standing water where the soil was saturated, and with each step he left large, wet prints that steamed up in the evening air like brief fossils. We reached a pool, a place where the stream widened and slowed, shaded by alders and cool as a cellar. The flames had not taken the water. He stepped into the pool up to his knees and drank in a manner that suggested both relief and ceremony. He faced away from me, and I watched the shape of his shoulders sink into something like gratitude. For a creature whose life had been lived in the margin between rocks and roots, the acceptance of a human's help sharpened into something I recognized from my own family, relief that one had not been abandoned. That night we both sat, oddly civilized, at the rim of the pool. The forest around us popped and sighed as the fire found old tinder and flamed for a while, but the big trees that had held a decade of their own were spared. I gave him the remaining tinned peaches. He ate them with the same deliberation as he had the Snickers. I brought out the harmonica and played, not to tame him but as a promise. The world was still capable of small, deliberate beauty. He listened. He tapped stones against stones, creating counterpoints to my notes. When the adrenaline ebbed hours later, when the sky was the deep black that holds the stars flat, and the smoke had thinned to a veil, we understood each other in a way I could not later write into policy. I did not think of the 22 minutes of footage at that moment, nor of the possible consequences of being discovered. My mind was narrow and sharp with one thought: keep this place safe. I promised him something then, clumsy and human, the sort of vow you make under a cathedral of trees because words feel small in the face of the living world. I told him, in the language of small gestures and steady hands, that I would return. I did not say where I would go tomorrow, nor did I cast this promise into a future I could predict. Decades later, I would find the weight of that promise to be one of the pillars of my life. But in the moment, with the smoke still in my hair and the last embers crackling in the distance, I leaned forward and touched his wrist. His skin under all that hair was warm and dry and smelled faintly of cedar. He did not recoil. I should have taken photographs of the burned fringe, logged the event with the ranger, filed a report about the near loss of habitat. The scientist in me knew the importance of that. The friend in me, the one who had watched him count marks on the wall and polish stones until they gleamed, felt the argument of conservation as something intimate and guarded. I chose the friend. I slept that night with the camera folded into a plastic bag and the tapes zipped away. I thought about the magnified ethics of modern fieldwork, the idea that evidence can become an invitation, that a revelation can sound like an alarm for anyone willing to turn knowledge into spectacle. There is an arrogance in thinking that documentation is the highest duty. Sometimes the highest duty is to hold a silence, to let a place be what it has always been, a place that remembers the right weather and the right companions. Dawn came with a cold that took the smoke out of the air like a hand winnowing flour. The overhang smelled of damp cedar and the sharpness of silt. He moved more slowly in the morning light.
The fire had taken muscle from him in ways it never shows on a quick inspection. I did what men do when they are trying to stitch a shame into a habit. I left things that would not catch attention if found. A small hand-carved bead he liked, wrapped in moss. A better harmonica in a cloth. Not that he needed it, but because I had been greedy and wanted him to taste brighter sound. He watched me do all this with an expression I would later understand as calculation. Is this honest? And I met him with the blunt, honest answer I could give. Yes. The burn line retreated over the next days into a haze of ash and new green. When I finally walked back to where my truck was parked and the world of radios and generator noise returned, the weight of the choice I had made felt like a stone in my pack. I had the 22 minutes of footage on tape, but the story had shifted from the objective language of science into the private grammar of obligation. I wrote notes, precise and dry. Dates, gear. Sony Handycam CCD TR81 recorded 22 minutes. Nikon FM2 shot stills. Panasonic AG455 left in base to conserve battery. I logged the tracks again. 17 inches, 7 wide, stride 5 feet. But the heart of the story had nothing useful to regulatory forms. When I came back to town, I told myself I'd make a plan. How to protect the overhang, how to watch, how to keep an eye on the pull of human curiosity. In a small diner, I told Marge one more time, and she slid my coffee across the counter and said without prying, "You always did like the long stories, Spencer." Her face wore the kind of knowledge townspeople acquire, the knowledge of what can be carried and what must be left alone. For weeks after the fire, sleep was a thin curtain over my thoughts.
I found myself rehearsing consequences. The footage leaked, someone buzzed the location, the habitat was trampled by curiosity and bulldozed by development. I could already anticipate the moral outrage on television, the bleachers of armchair experts, the sanctimonious petitions, and the expedient land grabs, all the ways a public imagination could turn a living being into a spectacle, or worse, into a commodity. The field biologist in me salted the wounds with a clinical list of what exposure would bring: cameras, trackers, and the slow suffocation of privacy. The person who had met those amber eyes weighed in a different currency, the small debt of a hand offered in a smoke-filled night. I chose secrecy. It was not a decision made once and then gilded by courage. It was made day after day, with small adjustments to my life. I kept the tapes in a locked compartment in my basement, not as proof, but as a ledger of promises. I deleted the high-res copies and kept the older, grainier footage that meant less commercially. I told myself that was a fair compromise, documentation enough for the one who had helped him, but not the kind of footage networks salivate over. It felt like a decency. Those weeks after the fire were full of small vignettes that then filled months. The way the creature sorted his stones one evening, the way he left a particular pebble leaning against the bed as if to mark a day, the way he sometimes sat and looked at the ridgelines as though counting the distance between noon and dusk. I returned whenever I could, with a humbler pack and a humbler heart. Once I left him a battery-powered lantern, not because he needed it, but because I liked the idea that the world could borrow tools. He set it by the bed and did not use it when the sun was up. It became simply another object in his collection. There were nights of real terror, too. A hunting party came through one autumn, loud and practical, talking in ways tangent to death. I hid in the brush until I felt safe. Old Man hid too, curling himself into a hollow the way some animals fold to disappear. Another time, a logging crew moved their machines too close, lines of diesel ribbons and chain teeth. I wrote letters to the county and left them where bureaucrats' hands might find them. I met a ranger who had the look of someone who had seen 1,000 arguments about land and who would not cross a line unless it was necessary. In the quieter hours, I learned how to read him not as a curiosity but as a companion. He stored things like a person stores memories. He arranged pebbles by size and weight the way an old man might sort coins. He used his hands with a kind of finesse that undermined the cartoons you hear about creatures of the woods. Once I watched him carry water in a bar cup. Once he used a particular stick to scratch patterns that resembled a child's game.
We would sit across from each other sometimes and play a game I taught him, a set of marks on the rock, 2 players tracing lines with sticks. He seemed to appreciate the ritual of competition, the marking of a moment. Capsules of those days formed a new moral landscape for me. I had come up as a scientist who believed that knowledge should be shared, that transparency equals truth. The forest taught me a different calculus, that sometimes the protection of the fragile beats the hunger for confirmation. I kept the 22-minute tape not as proof for others, but as memory for myself, a thing I could watch when the loneliness of conservation work became too heavy. One late afternoon, as the sun went like a coin out of the sky, I slid the tape into the old VHS deck I still kept at the cabin and watched the flickering amber eyes on a loop. I cannot say precisely when the line in me split between observer and caretaker. It was not a dramatic turning point, so much as the accumulation of small mercies and small risks. The Snickers, the harmonica, the nights spent calculating where a human voice might land if a search party came. The fire was the fulcrum that tipped many things into clarity. In saving him, I had also saved a part of myself that had been hardened by protocol and soot. I owed him my silence, and in that silence a strange thing began to grow. The belief that kindness, like a thrown rope, can be returned tenfold in measures we do not predict. When I finally walked away that season, I did it with a private, stubborn ceremony. I left him a pair of goggles, nothing practical, just an oddity. He set them on a rock and watched me. I promised to come back. I did not promise to bring a camera. I promised only to return. I drove back to civilization with the windows down and the smell of pine and smoke clinging to the upholstery. The world in town felt too loud that first week after I'd been back. Motels with neon that buzzed, small men in denim who never lifted their eyes from the TV. I did not tell Cascade Wildlife Productions what I had seen. I kept the Panasonic and the AG455 idle in the garage, their batteries drying in the climate of a life that had to choose privacy over exposure. Sometimes in the city I would sit at a table and doodle the shape of a print with a napkin pen, numbers accompanying it. 17 inches, 7 inches, stride equals 5 feet. Those numbers kept me honest. They were both measurement and memory, empirical hooks for the otherwise unquantifiable affection that had taken root. I taught a workshop that fall on field ethics and animal temperaments. I kept the story out of my slides but let the philosophy leak into my speech. A student later asked me why I encouraged secrecy in some situations. I said, carefully, because not everything that can be known should be made common. The student took it as a provocative thesis. I took it as a confession. Weeks became months, and the months braided into a contour of years.
I stayed in touch with the creature only the way that people with two lives do, by keeping a private calendar and honoring the spaces between obligations. I was always teaching myself how to be quieter in my steps and more deliberate in my intentions. Every time I came back to that overhang, I carried fewer tools and more patience. He responded with a slow generosity that felt like the repayment of a debt neither of us could quantify. There were nights when I stood on the ridge and watched him move like a slow meteor across the bedrock, and I thought about what it would mean to give his existence to a world that loves spectacle. I thought about the way human curiosity, once turned into searchlights, rarely returns a place to the dark. I kept the tapes because they were mine, because the amber eyes had asked for a witness who would not sell their existence. I kept the secret because keeping it felt like holding a life in my hands. I kept it because once you have been seen that closely by anything that lives, you learn the language of repayment. The ripples of that choice are not a tidy moral. They are messy, full of small sacrifices and the occasional pang of isolation. I lost some things by keeping silent. I lost the warmth of professional acclaim, the tidy compartments of public recognition, the easy conversations at cocktail parties, where a man can tell a story and watch it be swallowed by laughter. In exchange, I gained evenings where an amber light would catch in the moss, and a big, careful hand would tuck a pebble beside my boot like a badge of return. That exchange is what I owe the person listening now, and it's what I try to explain without betraying the place. There is a difference between documentation and devotion. My devotion nudged documentation aside. I kept the tape locked because evidence is a candle in a window. It calls to anyone who can navigate the night. I preferred to keep the candle inside the house. And yet, the thought of lack, of what would happen if I failed to protect him when it mattered, has haunted me more than any fear of being laughed at. The forest is patient, but not immortal. There are seasons when even the most careful plans fail. Fire, as I learned that August, is a theocratic sort of thing. It does not care for promises, only for fuel. When the season turned and I left the forest behind for the last time that year, the promise I had given him settled into the slow architecture of my life. I would come back. I would continue to guard the existence of something rare and unpublic. I would make decisions that violated certain scientific impulses in favor of a quieter, more painful ethic. I would choose companionship over career, the way a man chooses which house to keep warm in harsh weather.
In that first autumn after the fire, as my hands adjusted back to doorknobs and coffee cups in the hum of urban life, I understood something else. Protection is not a one-time act.
It is a commitment that eats at your schedule, that asks you to understate and underreport, that requires you to keep a ledger of small courtesies and to catalog episodes that mean nothing to anyone else. It is lonely work, and it is also the richest work I have ever known. The tracks were still there when I could get back. The communal marks on the stone wall had more scratches, faint and patient, like tally marks kept for reasons other than counting. Once, in a plenitude of foolish hope, I thought of making scales and maps and building a shelter with a small sign, "Do not disturb." But the thought recoiled at itself. No sign could protect what noise would unspool. So I learned to be careful. I learned to let possessions accumulate on his side of the bed, so that the trail back to civilization looked like nothing more than a place where a hermit might have left his bits. I gave him a new harmonica one evening and watched him place it under his pillow, as if tucking a secret under the headboard. I was a witness of a slow life and a small love, and I carried it like contraband. The fire, which could easily have been a turning point toward disaster, instead became the fulcrum that bound us. In saving him, the thing I feared most was the reciprocation of that deed. I had not expected reciprocity to be anything more than gratitude and a few stones thoughtfully placed. I was a man with a habit of underestimating the memory of the wild. The forest remembered the nights and the taste of cool water. It counted in scraping marks and in the arrangement of pebbles. It kept its own ledger. The thing that would happen later, decades on, was not yet visible in the motion of leaves. It moved in slow corridors reserved for patient things. But the seed of it, the knot in the rope that I tossed back then, the moment when I steadied a burning ember with a poncho, that seed was planted. I left that season with more than a pack and a set of numbers. I left with a promise anchoring me, and with the unshakable sense that something owed me, even as I owed something back. I kept the tapes. I kept the secret. I carried out into the town the smell of smoke and the memory of a pair of amber eyes that had once looked at me like a mirror. On the drive back, the road felt longer than it should have, as if the highways stretched under the weight of what I had chosen. I thought of the small life I had been sliding toward, a man who could live alternatively in two worlds if he wished, the public and the private, but who had to bear the cost of carrying silence. The cost is not always sadness. Sometimes it is pride. Sometimes it is the steady, quiet joy of knowing you have done right by a living thing. I had not yet imagined a family. That came later, as all complicated things do, gradually and with a tenderness that surprised me. For now I had nights of counting, anchoring, and cataloging. I had a secret the size of a being, and the responsibility to protect it.
And I had the memory of helping him through fire, a night when my hands had done what my conscience asked of them, and when, beneath the copper rim of sky and the hush of embers, an old, patient life had accepted my assistance. There are moments that become hinge points in a life. That night by the pool of water, when we smothered flames and shared tin peaches, and second, that coming back meant choosing what to keep and what to give away. The rest of my life, the practical life with its small human demands, waited for me with the patient injustice of time. When I finally shut the truck door and headed down the ridge, I glanced back once. In the dim line where the trees broke against the sky, a shape stood on the lip of the overhang. It was broad-shouldered and still as a stone. It raised one hand in a way that might have been a wave, or perhaps a farewell. I raised my own hand, foolish and inadequate, and then the road swallowed the sound of our secret. What happened after that, how those choices wound themselves into a different kind of life, and how the ledger of small mercies matured into a debt that would be repaid years later, is not the tidy part of the story. It is messy and slow and at times unbearable. But the arc that began in that amber eye and in the smoke of a late summer fire was already set in motion. I would learn how deep reciprocation can go, and how a thing saved once may build itself a way to save you in turn. The problem for me was not whether that reciprocity would occur. It was whether I was ready to live with the consequences of having given a life a reason to remember me. Years stacked themselves like old journals. Life pressed in with its polite demands, a mortgage that crept up on me like ivy, an office with fluorescent lights that did not forgive the dusk, conversations about retirement plans I was not sure I wanted to keep. I met Anna in a way that felt almost like a concession to ordinary luck, at a public lecture about human-wildlife coexistence I gave for a local college. She had a way of asking questions that cut straight to the human heart of conservation. Where I wanted to speak in measurements, 17 inches, 7 across, stride equals 5 feet,
She reminded me that the quiet work of protection is made up of daily choices: where to build, when to protest a road, how to make room in a life for a secret that won't fit in a spreadsheet. We married because the ordinary grief of the world seemed lighter shared. Anna did not ask me much about my younger life in the field. She let my past seep into our dinners in slow, comfortable ways. A stray harmonica note at the table, a comment about the smell of cedar after a storm, an old nicked maglite that found its place on the mantel.
She understood, without my having to spell it out, that some parts of me belonged to a time when rain sounded like data and silence meant safety. When I told her, in pieces at first, that I'd spent time away from town for work, filming bears and elk for Cascade Wildlife Productions, and making long, patient observations, she would nod and say, "You always did love long stories." I learned not to test how far she would push before silence settled between our sentences. We had 2 children, Mara, quick and curious, who loved to take apart my old gadgets to see how they worked, and Jonah, who kept to himself and learned to track birds after hearing a story once and deciding that it might be useful. They grew into a house filled with ordinary sounds: the clack of plates, a television softly left on in the evening, the scrape of homework pencils. Yet there was another life folded into mine like an old map tucked into a book: tapes in a locked box in the basement, Sony Handycam CCD TR81 footage, 22 minutes, a bank of stills from the Nikon FM2, the small ledger of dates and measurements, and the ache that came from not telling the entire truth. For years, my visits to the overhang dwindled to the frequency of an old ritual: a late summer pilgrimage when work allowed, a holiday visit if the idea of cedar and water pulled harder than town's gravity. I told myself I had found the right balance: family here, forest there, until the balance became a tightrope in a wind. I had promised him, clumsily and with no legal obligation, that I would return, but promises stretch when life fills a man's hands. The creature, old man as I continued to call him in the privacy of my head, continued to live a life I saw in fragments: the sonar of footprints that still measured the same, the sorted stones that collected like quiet accounting, the harmonica cradled in that same patch under the pillow. Time in his world was a stack of such small, faithful behaviors. He did not write, he arranged. When I did make it back, years would leak into the spaces between our meetings. He would be older in ways I could not measure. Small grays like lichens in his hair perhaps, a different flinch when a plane cut the sky, but he was unmistakably present. He remembered me. Memory is a fragile, surprising thing in non-human minds. The proof of his recall was not a greeting like a dog's wag, but a set of recognitions. The way he left a clean cobble beside my note, the way the scratch marks on the wall had a new notch that matched the day I'd last been there. The ledger had changed in increments, both meaningful and maddeningly modest. Secrets make marriages heavy with unspoken things. Anna found space in our life for my past the way a river finds its channel, by slow acceptance rather than declaration. Once, late into a winter night, I told her everything I could without giving away the place or the tapes.
I told her what it felt like to meet eyes that were amber and ancient, how the forest smells when it remembers rain, of tools found in a bed of cedar, of 22 minutes of grainy footage that I kept because it was less useful a spectacle than as a tether to a promise. She listened with a kind of practical grace that made me feel less foolish for having kept my silence. She did not insist on publicity, she did not demand a broadcast. She suggested sensible things instead: better locks, a trust to hold materials if ever there were legal trouble, and the occasional, pointed question, "Are you still going back?" that would root me back to reality. I was still a man who carried a battered maglite, the shape of its head familiar in my palm. Sometimes Mara or Jonah would ask about my time in the woods. I told them stories in fragments: the time a mother bear crossed a creek to avoid her cubs being spooked, the way a fox caches eggs under moss with a surgeon's care. I did not tell them about the harmonica tucked under the hair of a creature that moved like a slow mountain. My children grew up with a fondness for imagined monsters, lanky, friendly giants who left tidy piles of stones, and a respect for privacy that felt educated rather than imposed. Even Jonah, who loved tramping with me, was told that some things were not his to know. We built a life that required a small dishonesty to protect a larger truth. Decades slide into a different scale. The forest did not wait for my domestic life to be convenient. Development crapped on roads and tax schedules and new maps, but the overhang kept a quiet dignity. Fires, though, do not hold grudges. They keep calendar. We had seasons of close calls, prescribed burns that spiraled, careless campers who did not quench their fires properly, but nothing on the scale of that first night, until a year when drought bent the world low, and a wind came that never quite said sorry. It was an ordinary September afternoon, a month that always smelled like the memory of that first time. We had decided, as families sometimes do, to take a week off and go someplace intentionally removed from the hum of town. Anna wanted the kids to know the quiet I had learned to love. She wanted them to stand in a place where the night sky is unbroken by city light.
We rented a small cabin near public forest land, far from the overhang and under no illusions about the eyes that lived in the shadows, but close enough that the hills felt familiar to me in a way that made me restless. I thought of the overhang more as a ghost that season than a destination, a thing I kept in the lockbox of my mind. On the third day of our stay, Jonah and Mara persuaded us to hike a trail that curved out into a basin rimmed with pines. The kids were young then, Mara on the cusp of 16, quick to argue and quicker to forgive, Jonah 14, with hands that loved to learn knots.
We walked with backpacks and a small first aid kit, and the kind of confidence parents have when they have convinced themselves the map is sufficient. The heat that day made the air taste tinny, a sign I should have noticed. My watch said the humidity was low. My intuition felt the forest taut like a drum. We found the basin rim in late afternoon. It was one of those places where the light bends, golden and forgiving. The kids ran ahead, making a racket like small thunder, while Anna and I lingered on the ridge. When she rested her hand in mine, I felt the old quiet tug at me, and I told her, very simply, that I had been to places like this that felt holy. She smiled in a way that did not require confession. The world, for those few moments, was absolutely ordinary. Then the wind changed. At first it was a sound like 100 small insects shifting. Then the sky took on a bruise and the distant tree line trembled. Smoke was not yet a wall. It was a plume that moved like a thought across the horizon. We stopped all at once, a family mutely agreeing that something had altered. Joan appeared and said, "Is that cloud, Dad?" I told him to keep close. Mara, restless, wanted to keep going. Curiosity is a trait that can be merciful and dangerous in the same breath. We had a handheld radio in the pack and a small emergency kit. Someone on a passing trail shouted that there was a fire, possibly started by a vehicle spark on a gravel road farther down, perhaps by a charred cigarette. We could not know. The ranger station we used to call had a patchy signal across the basin, and the phone on the table had no bars. The trail back to our cabin ran through a narrow ravine filled with dry brush, a funnel that now, with the wind, could become a chimney for flame. I thought of the overhang. I thought of the pool and the way water had saved a life once. Not because I expected to see Old Man, there are boundaries I have long drawn, but because memory has a geography all its own. It takes you to the places where you've kept your promises. "We should go down now," I said. Anna tightened her braid and gathered the kids. We moved with the deliberate speed parents learn from drills and from everyday caution. Halfway down, a spot of overturned rock and a half-rotted log blocked the path. A recent storm had loosened debris. This place had not been touched in years, but gravity and people's things will relocate whether you look or not. A pocket of flame licked from a sun-warmed stump where Spanish moss and dry needles had gathered, and the wind was eager. I knelt and attempted to roll the log with Anna, but my shoulder hit stone and pain lanced, some old campsite injury acting up. The kids, adrenaline high, tried to wedge themselves between root and wood. That was when the first embers soared like a thrown coin and landed near our pack. Heat blossomed. Panic is a gnawing, useful animal.
For a few seconds, it lives between a parent's breath and action, and one must choose which muscle to trust. Anna's eyes, sharp and bright, found the kids and told them where to step. Jonah used the radio to call for help, voice thin with fear. The sun seemed to tilt. Flames began to climb the dry brush on either side of the trail, making the air shake with their hunger. This is the part where my past and present braided with the brutal intimacy of necessity. I thought, foolishly and surely like many men, that my decades of reading landscapes would suffice. I tried to lead the family across a narrow line where a small stream cut the trail, wet marshland that would be at least a temporary refuge. The children moved with me, but the log, rotted differently than I'd assumed, caught Mara's boot. She stumbled, and the log rolled on top of her ankle, pinning her with the sudden finality of a trap. "Hold on," Jonah yelled, fingers white on the rope of his backpack strap. Anna tried to lift the log, her jaw clenched. The log did not move. Heat was closer now. The smoke was a thick, bitter thing. The kids' faces were two halos of fear. I felt the old calculation from years in the field, the small list of feasible actions, but my hands trembled as if they were discovering new muscles. We were, in the softest sense of the word, stuck. Then something moved in the trees. At first I thought it was a deer. Shadows travel in forests, but the movement was a great deliberate thing. It emerged from the tree line not as a flash but as a slow negotiation, broad shoulders, hair that had the same lichened silver as the bark, a gait that spoke of enormous mass handled with a surprising gentleness. The muscles beneath the hair flexed not in threat but in calculation.
He stepped into the clearing like a boat easing to shore. Anna's hand found my arm. She went very still and said in a whisper that married wonder and the steadiness I had long admired, "Spencer?" The creature looked at me first. His amber eyes cut the smoke like a compass. There was recognition there, no dramatic choreography, no human word. He took a single step forward and then another, and his hands, large and calloused scale, closed around the log with a grace that belied sheer weight. He rocked it, found a fulcrum against a root, and with a small heave that included all the leverage his body could muster, he lifted. The log moved. It moved wide enough for Mara to wriggle free, tears streaking her cheeks, lungs already tasting smoke. The creature handed the log, not as a token but as a cleared obstacle, by rolling it aside gently with a motion that looked like an apology. He then crouched, placed a hand, huge, and in a child's eyes perhaps terrifying, on Mara's shoulder, and shepherded her to the wet seam of the trail. She did not scream, but leaned into the pressure of a palm and breathed in salt-wide like salvation.
The family, for the first time, saw him not as a legend, but as a present, patient thing acting with purpose. Jonah, mouth open, kept his hand fixed to the radio, as if it would anchor the surreal. Anna's face had an expression I cannot describe fully. It was a collision of awe, a sudden understanding, and a decision being made in the microseconds a parent lives through to keep the children whole. She did not cry. She moved with the decisiveness of someone who takes in information quickly and acts. The creature did not pause afterward the way a performer might bask in applause. He moved on to the burning brush and, in a way that made physical sense, used his weight and his reach to beat a path through the lower branches, creating a small firebreak. At one point, he scooped a shallow hole near the water, dragging earth with a skill that suggested long practice. He did not speak in words. He made a sound like a low, measured throat note, and it translated across the smoke as direction. We followed, because we did not have better options. He led us down a course that was not obvious from the trail map, a narrow wash where the wind eddied away from the ground, a bed of stones that held moisture under the scum of fallen needles. At one point, a falling ember caught at my sleeve and burned a shallow line across the denim. I slapped at it and felt my fingers blister. He looked back as if to check that I had felt it, and then moved on. There was no triumph in his face. He was a being handling an equation in which our survival was, for reasons I could not rightly explain, included. By the time ranger units and volunteer crews found us, hours had passed. The timeline of rescue stretches and compresses in memory. The family was huddled behind a berm of stones, breathing steam into the dark, soot in our hair. Mara's ankle swelled but was not broken. Small miracles happen inside the margins carved by better luck and good choices. The volunteer team had their lights and their efficient questions. They wrapped blankets around shoulders and handed hot beverages that tasted like small absolutions. The creature watched from the line of trees. He did not approach the human cluster of blankets and radios. He stood like a sentinel, and then, in a gesture that felt like a benediction, he turned and melted back into the forest, as if smoke were a cloak and he the rightful thing to cloak. Anna said little on the drive back to the cabin. She sat with the kids, eyes occasionally wet, the kind of quiet that means something inside has shifted and settled. Later, she took my hands, calloused and smelling faintly of smoke, and said, "Who was that?" I could have lied. I could have offered some rationalization about a rescuer we had not seen. There was a way out, to let the story be the thing people tell about luck and volunteer crews and good timing.
Instead, I told her the truth about the overhang, the 22 minutes of Sony footage, the harmonica in a bed of cedar, the Snickers and the flashlight. I told her of the time I smothered embers with a poncho and the way he drank from the pool like a ceremony. I did not, however, give up a map. I did not say where he slept. I did not hand over the tapes. I told a story that involved warmth and nuance rather than coordinates. Her face, when I spoke, did what her face had done before. It received the information with pragmatic tenderness. She did not ask for cameras or for interviews. She only said very quietly, "We owe him, and we owe you for keeping him safe until now." There are decisions after rescues that aching lungs force a family to make. We could have published, called the ranger, given statements that might have saved us a lifetime of speculation and conspiracy. We could have pressed the footage into a disc and watched it become a weapon of attention. We did not. Instead, we chose, together, the difficult, unshowy path of protection. We told the rescue crews only the parts that kept everyone safe, and declined to answer the curiosity of reporters who, by then, had caught the smell of news. The rationale was complex, part gratitude, part guilt, part the old ethics we had tried to live by, the idea that some things deserve darkness rather than floodlight. Mara, who had been on the verge of a teenage rebellion the week before, processed in a way that surprised me. She made art, small sculptures in clay that she later gave to the town's craft sale, but never explained. Jonah drew maps of bird calls and learned to knot a dozen different hitches. The children carried something private that changed them. They did not ask for fame. They did not become braggarts. Instead, they learned an older kind of discretion, the way people who grow up around secrets do, with a steady, protective instinct. The creature's intervention did not make us famous, and for that I am grateful. The town had its gossip, and for a while the rumor mill churned images and invented voices, but there was no concrete proof that could be picked up and sold. The tapes remained under my floorboards. I watched them sometimes, not for evidence, but to remind myself I had kept a promise. Months after the rescue, I went back to the overhang once, by myself, with a small thermos and the Nikon FM2. I left the camera on the ridge where it could see the approach, but would not be an explicit instrument of exposure. I walked with the gait of a man carrying both gratitude and a certain guilt. When I reached the pool where Old Man had once steadied his shoulders against fire, the water was a calm mirror. There were no obvious tracks. Season changes and animal traffic had recarved the paths, but there were rearranged stones and a harmonica tucked under moss, weathered now, the metal dulled by age. I sat at the rim and held it in my hand, feeling the cold hurt of memory.
He came at a distance this time, not like a thunderous entrance, but like a tide. He did not move with the naivete of a creature seeking praise. He moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had done what seemed necessary and did not want to be thanked. When he saw me, his eyes found mine, and a recognition slid across the line between us like a meeting rope. I thought for a moment of all the small promises men make, to a child, a spouse, a place. Sometimes they are kept, sometimes they fray. He did not speak. His throat made a small sound I had catalogued years ago as inquiry and acknowledgement. I set the harmonica down where he could take it, and left him a small can of peaches wrapped in wax. It was an ordinary gesture to the point of embarrassment, but ordinary can be a kind of prayer. We do not live in a world that rewards secrecy, not in the public ledger. Secrecy is an armor that rusts. Yet there are times when armor is precisely what a life needs. After the rescue, we made a few practical moves. I met with a ranger privately and suggested less intrusive measures for patrols in the area. I supported a small, community-funded conservation easement that put pressure on development in nearby ridges. We never mentioned the creature. The ranger, an older man with a memory for birds and patience for long arguments about land, did what he could within his remit, and rolled his eyes when asked about mystery saviors. The years that followed were gentler than the first seasons had been. The family grew into its new skin, Mara to college and a job that took her to a city with lights she loved, Jonah to field biology, where his curiosity led him to study birds in a manner I understood but had never vocalized to him. Anna and I aged in the measured way of two people who share a life, a series of small accommodations, and the way the eye softens around the edges of a partner's face. I kept visiting, not as often as before, responsibilities demanded, but often enough that the ledger of small courtesies remained active. He would appear sometimes at the pool, sometimes only as a rearrangement of stones. We developed a system in which no one else in town knew its details. The tapes were pressed in a box, and there were nights when curiosity gnawed, and I would extract a fringe of footage to remind myself of the why beneath the work. I tell you this not to romanticize what followed, but to trace a truth. Reciprocity is not neat. It is messy and wrapped in obligations you did not plan for. On that wild September when he saved my family, I thought I understood the simplest narrative. Help given is help returned. It is more complex. The return can arrive as a muscle memory translated into a physical intervention. It can arrive decades later when the muscles of a creature are old and patient. It can arrive because the wild remembers, and because debts are not measured in currency, but in a ledger of places remembered.
The choice to keep the secret after the rescue was not unanimous in our town. A handful of people suspected something strange, and a few sought the glint of notoriety. A reporter once came to our door asking if we had seen a local legend. Anna told him, with a firmness that would have been convincing even to someone less discerning, that we had been saved by a volunteer crew and to contact the county liaison for details. He left with a notepad and a disappointment that tasted like a sour apple. The tapes remained, yellowed corners and the grainy amber eye fixed in a loop. Some nights, when the house was quiet and the children asleep, I would sit with the mag light in my lap and wonder what responsibility looks like across generations. I thought of the way the creature must perceive time, long, measured, not the impatient tick of deadlines and mortgage payments. The debt felt reciprocal and human. He had saved my family not because he owed me any legal contract, but because there was, in the life of the wild, a mathematics of exchange that does not always require a ledger visible to human eyes. There are practical things to take care of after such events. Mara's ankle healed with luck and doctor care. Jonah wrote a paper on fire ecology that quietly helped local policy 30 years later. Anna and I went to town meetings and spoke for careful land use with the kind of civility that disarms suspicion. We did not mention that a creature had lifted a log to free a teenager. The truth, like many good things, remained intimate. Years later, when I am older and my hands have lost some of their steadiness, my memory of the rescue sometimes refracts into myth in my own head. When I watch the 22 minutes of the Sony tape, grainy, hand-shaken, the amber eyes catching the light, I see not a spectacle, but a mirror. The tape is less about proof than about memory. It is an anchor when the loneliness of protection tugs and when the weight of a secret gnaws at me. I have never released it. I suppose I could have arranged for sealed transfer to a museum or an archive with the stipulation that it be opened in 500 years when the politics of human curiosity have dulled, but I do not imagine there will be such patience. The rescue had consequences beyond the immediate gratitude of a family kept whole. It changed the shape of how I thought of obligation. It taught my children a tacit lesson in discretion and in the odd mathematics of kindness. It taught me that a debt repaid need not end the covenant. It often renews it. After the night of smoke and the lifting of the log, I understood that the promise I had made in the pool's water had come due in a way I did not foresee. In helping him escape, I had planted a seed of duty in a mind that shelters memory in a way more durable than I had imagined. I do not tell this story to garner sympathy or awe. People will read it and decide whether they believe me, which is their right.
What matters to me is this. There are choices we make, sometimes small, sometimes enormous, that pull the future in tight curves. The choice to protect instead of publish, to keep a tape under floorboards, and to teach a family a mode of discretion is not always a heroic arc. Often it is a daily practice of refusing the glare. The last time I visited the ridge, I took Anna with me. She had aged with me and carried in her the kind of patience that had made silence between us a thing of comfort rather than contention. We walked in the late light, not to test the world, but to witness it. The forest smelled like a chapter closing, late summer turning to a sauce of green and smoke. We sat by the pool, and the harmonica lay between us like an old promise. He came, as he had many times before, slow as a tide, dignified as weather. When he saw Anna, he did not change his posture. He did not press as if seeking favor. He accepted our existence in the way someone accepts the enduring presence of a tree he has climbed since childhood. I think some part of him knew that the family he had saved had kept its end of a bargain, protection in exchange for life. We did not speak of making the secret public. How could we? Some things are too tender, and publicity is a machine that chews tenderness into pulp. We sat and watched him arrange stones, as he had done for decades, like a ritual of bookkeeping. At one point he left a pebble on the ground next to Anna's shoe. She picked it up and turned it in her hand like a talisman. "Keep it," he seemed to say, in a way that did not use words. She capped the pebble. If there is a moral in this long, crooked account, it is not that animals repay debts in tidy human shapes, nor that acts of kindness always yield the balance you expect. It is that kindness changes the topology of a life. It rearranges what you are willing to guard. It enlarges, in a modest but immutable way, the circle of obligations. When a being in the wild remembers you and acts not for spectacle but out of the ledger kept by its own memory, the transaction is not merely practical, it is a reconciliation. I do not know how long he will remain in that place.
I only know that for as long as the forest holds its character, and for as long as my chest holds a memory of ember and water, I will honor what happened. The rescue did not make me heroic. It made me emphatically responsible. It asked me to hold the secret as carefully as I would hold a child's hand near a fire. If you are listening to this and find yourself faced with a similar ethical fork between documentation and protection, between exhibition and seclusion, consider the weight of what you would expose. Consider that sometimes the bravest thing is to keep something safe from the light. Consider that kindness does not always demand repayment, but when repayment arrives, it can be as quiet and as immense as a friend lifting a log.
If this story has touched something in you, whether wonder, skepticism, or a hard ethical question, I'd like to know what you'd do in my place. Leave a comment below with the choice you think I'd make, and if you appreciate long-form, careful stories about nature and moral choices, consider subscribing for more like this. Thank you for listening. We left the pool that evening with Anna holding a small pebble in her palm and the children sleeping in the car. As we drove away, the forest opened like a hand closing, and there at the ridge's edge, a broad outline stood for a long time, watching us go. The amber in his eyes caught the last light and held it, as if to measure me once more and then file me away in a long, patient memory. I kept my promise. He kept his. Life is a ledger written in small acts, and sometimes, decades later, those acts find a way to pay us back.